You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 1, Episode 3, Maeve. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today we'll be talking to Maeve, a fellow adoptee who will be sharing her search and secondary rejection story with us. We discuss some deep feelings and how our views of adoption shifted when we became parents. We wrap up our time with some recommended resources for adult adoptees. Wow, I'm so happy to be interviewing today Maeve Kelly, and that is a pseudonym. She's asked me to use her birth name to share with you guys today. Maeve, I'm so excited to hear your adoption story. Tell us about when you were born, when you were relinquished.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's not often that I get to talk about this, so I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay.
So I was born in the 70s. I was relinquished immediately after birth within about 7 days. I was born in the Philadelphia area and born at a Catholic hospital there. And there's an orphanage. There was an orphanage at the time. They called it an orphanage, but it was essentially a part of the hospital that they turned over to infants like myself that were being relinquished. And I was relinquished right after birth, and my adoptive parents took me home 7 days later.
And where did your family have, your adoptive family have other children?
They did. They had already had a biological son who was 7 years older than me. And then they wound up having another biological daughter 4 years after me. So I grew up as the middle child and the only adopted child in the family.
And so do you know anything about the circumstances of your birth mother choosing to relinquish?
I do. Kind of an unusual story, maybe. So my birth mother is an RN, and she was one of 10 children born in Ireland. She came to New York City to pursue her profession in nursing, and she met my birth father there, wound up having a relationship with him, became pregnant with me, was not happy about the situation, and decided to move to Philadelphia in order to hide the pregnancy from everyone that she knew. So she moved to Philadelphia. She took a job at the hospital where I was born. I'm not sure how it was arranged that would happen, but she took a job there and then gave birth to me and then went back to New York City. And so the reason I was in Philadelphia, born there, was just because she went there to, like I said, hide the pregnancy. I know that she was incredibly embarrassed and upset to find herself pregnant, and worked in a Catholic hospital in New York and then wound up working in this Catholic hospital in Philadelphia, turned me over to Catholic Charities. And her one request was that I be placed with a Catholic couple. One thing I found out later about her, so I don't know if you know too much about sort of the Catholic Charities, maybe you do after doing some research, but their way of doing things was they would give you this, or they would fill out this sort of 2-page non-identifying information document. And it went with the infant, in the file, and they would describe who the birth mother was, and then whatever information that the birth mother wanted to give about the father. And I found out later I'd had that information. Catholic Charities had turned that information over to my adoptive parents, and I'd had the information for a long time. And she had told Catholic Charities that my birth father was German, and he wasn't. He was Jewish. And I found out that later, the first time I ever talked to her, when I was 40 years old. I had one conversation with her, and she said, "I need to tell you something. I remember that I told Catholic Charities that your father was German. He's not. He's Jewish." So that was a big shock to me to hear that. I think probably one of the reasons that, she was so desperate to get, to lie about the fact that he was German, and she was so desperate to get me placed with a Catholic family, is maybe the guilt that she felt around that. I'm sure she lied about the fact that he was Jewish because maybe, a Catholic family wouldn't have agreed to adopt me if they'd known that I was half Jewish and not German, as she had indicated.
It's such a different time back then than now, right? Oh
yes.
My goodness.
Yes.
So there's all sorts of layers that it sounds like of shame that she had.
Yes.
Okay, so you had a conversation with her. Tell me how you found her.
It's interesting. So, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the United States, until 1985, I believe, you were still able, as an adoptee, to get a document from the Bureau of Vital Statistics. It's not your original birth certificate, but it's a document that this other agency in Pennsylvania kept, and it has your name, has the, adopted child's birth name and the mother's name. I'm not sure why they keep these information separate from the birth certificate. But in any event, up until 1985, adoptees, even though their original birth certificates were sealed and had no option of getting them, you could still get this document, this statement of vital statistics. My adoptive parents got that in 1985, just before the laws changed. I've had that since 1985. I've known what her name is. And I never did anything with it. I tried to pretend that it didn't exist. I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter. I tried to convince myself that I didn't care. And so I didn't do anything until I was in my early 20s. I went away to law school, and I couldn't shake it anymore. I had to do something about it. I had to find her and find out who I was and why I was on the earth. So I actually started with Catholic Charities. I thought that was the most respectful way to go, rather than just hire an investigator and find her. I had her name and I had her date of birth. I knew I could find her if I wanted to, if I really wanted to. But I decided to go through Catholic Charities. Unfortunately, they strung me along for a really long time. Told me that they were looking for her. They were told me that they were sending her letters, and that they were hopeful that she was going to call back, and just kept me going for maybe 10 years. I would check in once a year with Catholic Charities and ask them how it was going, and they would tell me they were going to get back to me. I should just keep praying about it, and ask me how my adoptive parents felt about the search.
Oh my goodness.
In any event, at the age of 40, I'd had enough, and I knew, I had her name and I had her date of birth, and I hired an investigator, and she found her in about 6 hours.
Wow.
And called me back and said, "Well, I found her. Here's her name. Here's her address. This is where she lived." What happened then was my mother, who had been getting all these letters from Catholic Charities for years and throwing them away, she had kept the contact information for the person at Catholic Charities who had been contacting her. She got a call from this private investigator. She knew what it was, and she called Catholic Charities and said, "How dare you have given out my information?" And Catholic Charities didn't know what she was talking about. The representative called me and said, "Your birth mother just called, and apparently you found her. Is that accurate?" And I said, "Yes." And they yelled at me and said, how dare I do that?" And it was against the law, and I was upsetting everyone, and it was a pretty awful phone call. But to make a long story short, they agreed that they would set up a call between me and my birth mother, be an intermediary. So they set up the call. Catholic Charities. They gave my birth mother my contact information, and she called me maybe a week later. And that was about 5 years ago, something like that.
So one phone call.
One phone call.
How long did it last, and what did you talk about?
It lasted maybe a half an hour. It was surreal. It was surreal. She had a brogue. I knew that she was from Ireland, but to actually hear her, with a brogue, it was it was, I can't describe it except it being surreal. It was very emotional. I was trying to hold it together. And what I really, really didn't want to do was scare her off. And I had no idea. I mean, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if she was going to be angry with me. I didn't know if she was going to deny my existence. I didn't know if she could potentially, be happy to be talking to me. I certainly hoped for that. I actually wrote out things I wanted to say, and I just tried to keep it really light. I went over some of the things that were in my 2-page non-identifying information that I'd gotten from Catholic Charities. And we actually had a laugh about some of the things because they had just made stuff up. Like they said in this non-identifying information that my birth parents had met because they were in the orchestra in New York City, and that my mother was an accomplished violinist. And so I asked her about that, and she started laughing. She said, "I don't know where that came from. I have never played the violin in my life." And then she asked me about my family, and she said, "Well, you have an adoptive brother, right?" And I said, "No, my brother is biological, to my adoptive parents." And she was silent. And I said, "Well, did you think that he was adopted?" And she said, "Yes, they told me he was adopted." And that was, one of the reasons that I really liked the idea of you being placed with them. I found out there were some real untruths going, both ways. Of course, we laughed about the music thing. I asked her a little bit. I said, is there anything I need to worry about with my medical history? And, she told me there wasn't. I didn't ask her about my father because I was afraid to scare her off. I was really, really scared to scare her off because this was such an important moment for me. I didn't want her to run. So I didn't ask. And I just said, I also didn't want to keep her on the phone. I wanted to keep it light. And so I said, I'd love to continue the conversation somehow, whether it's another phone call or whether it's a meeting or whether it's a letter, but I'd love to just try to, continue this conversation in some way. And she said that she would think about it. I really thought about it. And then about a month later, I wrote her a letter. And I enclosed pictures of myself and my 3 children. And I spent days, more than days, weeks working on that letter, just perfecting it, trying to get it to strike just the right tone of respectful, but not coming on too strong, just trying to say the right thing so that she wouldn't reject me. And I just said, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I just said, I want to know who I am. It's important to me to have a biological connection with someone in the world. And I don't want to disrupt you and your family. I'm not looking for another mother. I don't expect you to do Christmases with me from now on. It's not what I'm looking for. I just want to have a connection with someone in the world who's related to me. And I hope that we can meet someday or talk again. And then I waited. And about a month later, I got a letter from a lawyer. It was a horrible letter. It was a nasty letter. And I'm a lawyer, and so I didn't need that. I didn't need the fact that some law firm had taken on this case and written this letter to me after having read my letter, and my letter was so personal. And I got a letter from this lawyer, and he said, my client doesn't desire any further contact from you. Please be advised that any further contact is unwarranted, and please never contact her again. And enclosed to the letter to me was my letter to her and the pictures.
I'm so sorry.
No.
I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
That's just devastating.
It was devastating. So what I did was I did what I had done for 40 years before that. I put it away. I couldn't, it was so painful that I just put it away. And I told myself it didn't matter. And, there's an analogy I think of sometimes when I think about what I've done to put those feelings away. It's like you have a box and you put all those feelings and all that hurt and shame, and you put them in the box, and you close the box up, and you close it with like duct tape and locks, and you just close it as hard as you can, and you put that box in like the deep recesses of your closet, in the dark corner of your closet, and you put all that hurt and shame in that box. And sometimes, when you're getting dressed, you look at that box and you see it and you know it's there, but you ignore it. You tell yourself that it's not there. And so that's what I did. I put all my hurt and shame and sadness and devastation in that box, and I put it in the deep recesses of my closet. And I put it there for 5 years or so. And only more recently, like in the last year, have I, gone into my closet and taken that box out and opened it up and let myself feel those things.
It's easy and difficult to put things away in the box, but they come out whether or not you go and willingly open it.
Yeah.
If you left it any longer, it was going to come out, right? Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think once a box is open, like I can't close it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't do it. I can't close it again. It's open, and I have to let myself feel these things. I'm letting myself for the first time really feel these things. And I think that's good. I think it's good. It's healthy to feel it and not pretend that it's not there.
The things that you said about how you were treated by Catholic Social Services when you were looking and you kept contacting them, and also your birth mother, like they just treated you still like a child.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Like you're never allowed to grow up, and I don't understand.
Yeah. Undeserving, and how dare you, very much like that. Yeah. And it's, it's surprising. one of the most frustrating things for me recently, after I've, sort of been reading a lot more and quote unquote come out of the fog about adoption. The most frustrating things for me is when people say things have changed. Oh, things are so much better now. You went through a terrible time, but things are so much better. It's not true. They're not better. They're not better at all because of the attitudes that are still associated with folks like me, adult adoptees who are just looking for, the most basic human knowledge in the world about why they're on the earth and the way that we're treated. And the attitudes associated with that, things have not changed. Things are not better. They're not better at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was born in 83. I was allowed to get my non-identifying information when I was 18. And then later on, the Alberta government opened the records and I was able to get my identifying information. And that's how I was able to find my birth mother and my birth father. That's really still rare as far as I know. There's so many states and provinces that have closed records. And just like yourself, you had to hire an investigator. So fortunate that your adoptive parents had her name.
It is fortunate for all the terrible things that my adoptive family did and didn't do around my adoption. That was the one thing that they did that was right. That was right. That there was apparently a lot of press going on around that time in 1985, right before the law changed and this, Department of Vital Statistics closed the information forever, and it's still closed now. There was a lot of press, and a lot of adoptive parents went ahead and got those certificates right before the end. And it's funny because mine is stamped like February 1985, and I know that's right before the law changed. So if it weren't for that, I definitely would not know who she was. I'm positive about that.
And so you don't have your birth father's name then?
No.
And have you ever tried to look for him?
I used to look for him all the time just because I knew, although I think she probably lied. I mean, I don't know who he is. And, she gave him a first name on the non-identifying information that I have from Catholic Charities, but nothing else. I used to look around, and also it said that he was a lawyer. So I used to look in sort of like any records of lawyers of different states. I would look for his name and what I thought his address may be. I was always looking, but I have no idea. He could be anybody. I was joking with my husband today. He could be Bernie Sanders. I have no clue. He very well may be. I'm not kidding. I mean, he's the right age. It's a strange thing for people that aren't adopted. Whenever I go to a new city, especially New York City, and I'm walking down the street, every time I pass somebody that looks a little bit like me, or maybe my father's age, or maybe like, my mother's age or what have you, I'm always looking at that person wondering if they're related to me. They could be related to me just like anybody else could be related to me. I feel like I'm related to no one and I'm related to everyone.
When you first had children, did anything shift for you?
Tremendously. I felt a connection with someone for the first time that I had never felt, ever. It was this visceral, primal connection that I felt with my first child when he was born. And I realized how unnatural adoption and relinquishment is. That there must have been some major social forces at work for my mother to have walked away from me like that and given me to perfect strangers. I could never have done that, with my son. And I also realized, I think I faced it for the first time, that my parents, of course, think of me differently than they do my brother and sister. Of course they do. And I don't fault them for that. That's just life. I mean, that's just reality, and that's okay. I don't think that adoption has to be a worse relationship. I think if you've adopted children, you have biological children, I don't think you necessarily love your adopted children less, but you love them differently. And I think it's important for adoptive parents to just acknowledge that. It's true. It just is true. There's no way that my parents felt about me the way they felt about my brother and sister. No way. Not after I've had my own children. And I feel that connection with them. I look at them and I see myself. It's visceral, it's primal, it's human at its most basic level. Yeah, to answer your question, yes. I think I felt loss. I think I let myself finally accept it, that being adoptive is not the same as being a biological child. It's just not.
Yes. I couldn't have put it better. I really couldn't have put it better.
I hope that doesn't make you feel bad. I was just thinking, I hope that doesn't make you feel bad, because, you're being a adoptive person too,
No. We're on the same page.
Okay.
You mentioned before that you were out of the fog, and I don't know if all of our listeners would recognize that phrase. Where did you first hear that, and how would you unpack that?
When I started, like I said, I put that away about 5 years ago, and my hurt, and I just tried to pretend like it hadn't happened. And then about a year ago, I just started very gradually, Googling and looking things up and reading things on websites. And the first website I ever found was called Lost Daughters, as I'm sure you've heard of it. And it's a sort of collection of pieces written by women adoptees about their experiences. And that was the first time I had heard the term out of the fog. And it really resonated with me. I felt like I was coming out of the fog, and it was good to put a term on it.
Yes.
And also, I think I always struggled with, well, I'm a bad person if I have these thoughts or feelings or sadness. I need to work through that because there's so many other adoptees who are totally fine with being adopted. They don't care. So there's something wrong with me. I have an issue. I have a problem. They're normal and I'm not normal. And then I realized they're in the fog. I'm out of the fog.
Their boxes tightly bound up.
Right. And so the term for me was it was very freeing to realize that I am not necessarily the one that's wrong in feeling this way. It felt really good to hear that term, out of the fog.
Yeah, I had a similar experience when I was first. Well, I was coming out of the fog. I just didn't know it. I've always felt my whole life that I have to be grateful that I'm adopted. And I was an only child. I had a happy upbringing, fine childhood. Everything was, just normal family stuff, nothing traumatic or anything. And I always felt different than my adoptive family. I always felt that I wasn't exactly where I was supposed to be. But because I really felt like I was supposed to feel grateful, I felt so guilty for those feelings of wanting to know where I came from, wanting to know my history. And when I started coming out of the fog was when I reunited with my birth father, and then subsequently had my children. We actually had been planning to adopt prior to that, because I did feel a sense of that I owed that to the world.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that we were able to shift directions and instead have our own biological children, because that's really been a meaningful change for me in my worldview.
It's so interesting, isn't it? How, you think about adoption in one way and it's always changing. I think it's just a constant change with me. I thought about it one way, 30 years ago, and I thought about another way 20 and then 10 and then 5. Every day I feel like I learn a little more. I think about it a little bit more, and I change a little bit. It's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, right?
for better or worse, yeah.
Were your adoptive parents, were they, did they talk with you about the fact that you're adopted and talk with you about their decision to adopt you and all of that?
I always knew I was adopted, so it definitely was always out there. And they adopted because they were infertile. And they waited a very long time to adopt me. So my parents are older. My mom was 38 and my dad was 40 when they adopted me.
Wow.
I knew they moved to be closer to social workers that would do the home study and things. So I knew that my adoption really disrupted their life, and they really focused to have me. They focused their whole life plan to have me. And once they adopted me, then they moved back up to where they were before and in northern Alberta.
Wow.
Only in the last few years, I found out that they had actually planned to do a second adoption, but because mine had taken so long, they just sort of decided against it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just unspoken, really. I don't feel like we talked about it very much.
Yeah.
Now, how about yourself? You had mentioned before that you just kind of hinted at some things with your family, so.
It was never discussed.
Okay.
Never. It was a subject that was never, ever discussed. I can remember I always knew I was adopted. It wasn't a secret from me.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't some big reveal, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was always there. It was a fact. But beyond that, it was never discussed in any way. There's no discussion of why they adopted me. I have kind of put two and two together and realized it was because they were having trouble conceiving. But there was no discussion of how they felt about me or how I felt about it. That's for sure. And when I would I would say maybe 5 times in my entire life we ever discussed it. The reaction always was a little bit of anger from my mom and telling me that it didn't matter and she didn't care that I was adopted and it just doesn't matter. And then kind of a changing of the subject. And that was it. I would do these projects at school, like we all have to do on ancestry and family tree, that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I used my adoptive family. And there was no discussion with my adoptive family on that. They would dutifully help me figure that out. And I'd write down all of their, relatives and turn that in to the school. I would go to the doctor. I can distinctly remember being at the doctor, the pediatrician, and a discussion going on about how tall I may get. And the discussion was about my adoptive family. The doctor would say, oh, well, let me see. Let's see, you are 5'4" and your husband is 6 foot. So I'd put her, she'd probably be about 5'6". It's the average of the two of you. I remember standing there just thinking, this is so weird. But I couldn't say anything because it was just a subject that was not discussed.
Yeah. And did you look similar to, do you look?
I do. I look similar to my father.
Okay.
I look similar enough that it was able to be that way,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I look similar enough, and it just kind of, occasionally my dad would say things to me. It was an angry subject with my mom. She didn't, we couldn't talk about it at all. My dad occasionally would say to me, whisper to me, things like, well, you're really the only Irish one in this family, because his ancestry was Irish, but many generations away from Ireland. They had, his great-grandfather, let's say, had come from Ireland. And when there'd be Irish music playing or something like that, he would whisper to me, well, you're really the Irish one here. Things like that. I think he got a kick out of it and didn't realize the devastating loss that it was for me.
Mm.
There was never an acknowledgement ever in my entire life that it was a loss. I didn't have biological relatives. It was just never discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Never. Never asked me. There was never a question put to me. How do you feel about it? I grew up feeling that it was a shameful secret. Very shameful. Because it was never discussed in any kind of healthy way. So part of coming out of the fog for me is, being able to talk about it with, folks like you.
Right.
I've never talked about it before because it was so, so shameful to me.
I think I got that same message now that you're saying that, and I don't feel like we talked about it ever either. Yeah, that's the message.
Yeah. Doesn't matter, so stop talking about it. It doesn't matter to me. Is the message that I got. Doesn't, my mother would say, it doesn't matter. There was a very strange group that they enrolled in. It's such a strange thing. I'm sure it was going on at the time, but they belonged to the group they called it the Mothers Club. And a bunch of families with adopted kids would get together and do social things. And this went on for a couple of years where every so often we'd have, this is when I was really young, every so often we'd have to get together with these other families from different towns. And the only connection was that they had an adopted child. And the parents would socialize in one room. I don't know what they were talking about. Maybe I always got the impression they were talking about how terrible it was to have an adopted child. That's what I always thought it was about.
Oh, no.
Because I was like, well, why would they get together with these folks? It must be a support group of some kind, is my thought. We must be so terrible that they need support from each other. But in any event, we'd get together with these families, and I remember thinking to myself, I just so wish that was my sister. I don't want to be the weird one. I don't want to be the adoptive one. I want to be the regular kid. They never talked to me about why they were bringing us to these groups. We just went to these groups, and there was no discussion. It was just we'd go to these groups, and I would just die inside, wishing that I was the real kid and not the adoptive one. And then we would go home. It was so strange. Yeah, besides like that weird adopted kid thing, and that's about it. It was never discussed. Never, ever, ever discussed. And I was the only adoptive kid in all of my cousins on my father's side. There were 17 of us. I was the only adoptive cousin. Every time we'd get together with this part of the family, it was always a gigantic discussion about who looked like who. And I just wanted to crawl into a hole and die. It was horrible.
Do you still get triggered by that?
Tremendously.
Yeah.
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 You do too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anytime anyone says anything about so-and-so looks like so-and-so in a family situation, I'm just like, oh my gosh, must be nice to know that.
I feel the same way. And it's not, and it's like, I think probably you and I are so sensitive to it because it's everywhere. I don't think people realize how it is so prevalent in our society to talk about the traits that we get from our biological relatives, and not just what we look like, but, oh, you must get that from your mom. Oh, that musical talent, that must be from your mom. Or, oh, you get this from your dad, or you're just like your dad, you're just like your uncle so-and-so.
Yeah. And
that's so prevalent in our society. Not just with like medical records, which is obviously becoming more and more important, your DNA on, for medical reasons, but everything else too. And I'm triggered every day by that.
Mm-hmm.
Every day I'm triggered by that. Absolutely. Yeah.
So my adoptive mom will say things to me around my children like, oh, this child is so much like this other person in her family. And I think... Oh, okay then. You tell yourself what you need to, because they're not related.
Do you get angry though? I get angry.
I do. Yeah, I get very angry about it. And I mean, she's just making conversation, and I know she doesn't mean anything by it, but it really does upset me.
Me too. So much. And I think it's because for me, it feels like they're not acknowledging my loss. Like they're trivializing my loss by saying that. It's almost like, how dare you? My parents do the same thing with my children. Oh, they'll say about my son, oh, don't worry about him. He'll grow because so-and-so grew really late. He grew when he was in college, my uncle or what have you. And I just look at them like, are you kidding me? That has nothing to do. And the fact that you're even saying that, again, you're just not acknowledging the reality in front of you and what I've lost.
Yeah. So I don't want to say it's so nice to hear that from you, but it's so validating, right? Like, it's like, okay, our feelings are normal. And
oh my God, yes.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear that someone else feels that way.
Yes, I know. And it's like, and I think because the dominant narrative it still is that we should just be so grateful and happy. And, you just see all these memes all the time. Biology doesn't matter. I don't care about DNA. Love is all you need. It's no, absolutely no. No, 1,000 times. No. And and it does feel so good to talk to you, Haley, because I so rarely can talk about this with anyone. Mm-hmm. I actually have, do you have any siblings? Do you have any biological siblings?
I have 3 half.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did they react to you?
Really wonderfully, actually. At first, they were very surprised that their dad had extracurricular activities.
Yeah. Right.
But once they got over that shock, they've been so welcoming and amazing. And I'm just their big sister now. It's really incredible. So they're They're all younger than me, obviously. And two of them have graduated from high school, and the youngest will just be starting high school in the fall. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's been pretty incredible to watch them grow up over the last 5 years. I have a lot of grief over the loss of their first years, but I'm just grateful for the time that we've had since then.
And you're growing up as an only child. That must have been even more meaningful and surreal to have these siblings now in your life.
It's so bizarre.
I can't imagine.
It's so bizarre. When I first went there to meet them, they live in another province. When I first went there to meet them, and like the banter back and forth and the teasing and stuff, I was just like, I cannot handle this. I don't. And my husband, he's from a family of 4, so he totally understood. But I'm just like, how can you treat each other like this?
Right? That's funny.
So I do feel used to it now, but it was quite an adjustment.
Wow.
Yeah. But that's, for me, I've gotten to see the similarities between me and them and my dad and even some of his siblings. So some of his, my extended family on his side. And that's all been really both healing for me, but also triggering. It's like, right. I don't know. It's,
oh my God. I mean, there's never a happy ending in these situations.
No.
I mean, even the best possible outcome where they are welcoming to you and they don't think you're out for money or an axe murderer or what have you, still, it's like you still lost so much. You lost that relationship with them. You know, you're still on the outside.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I am. So, Maeve, what could your birth mother do now if she changed her mind and wanted to connect with you and rebuild a relationship with you? What could she do that for you?
It wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take anything. I'm so desperate to make a connection with her. I'm so desperate to know who my father is. She wouldn't have to do anything. Nothing. I got a terrible letter from her lawyer saying to stay away. And I have, but all she has to do is pick up the phone and call me. She knows exactly where to find me. You know, even if she can't bring herself to have a conversation with me, I would certainly love to have a communication with her 2 children who are my half siblings. I know exactly who they are. I know exactly where to find them. I've seen many pictures of them on Facebook and other places. It's a loss that I can't describe. I would love to communicate with them, but I can't bring myself because I'm so afraid of getting hurt again. I am afraid that if I reach out to them, that they're going to do what she did and reject me. And I don't know if I can take another rejection again. You know, I've held off communicating with them. I think at some point I will reach out to them, even if I never reach out to her again, just because I feel like I'll never regret trying, but I will regret not trying. And I don't regret making contact with my birth mother at all. I don't regret looking for her. I don't regret making contact with her. I would never regret that. And so I feel like I need to go ahead and do the same with my siblings at some point. When I feel a little stronger, I will.
I hope you do connect with them. I just want to tell you that it's your right to have a relationship with them. And even though she's kept you a secret, I think.
She has.
Yeah.
Yeah, she has.
I feel like it's still your right. So, it might not be right now, but I hope you do.
I hope so too. I hope I can bring myself to do it. I will. I just need to get a little stronger. I think I need to be ready for whatever may come from it. I can't, at this point, I think if I reached out to them and they rejected me in the way that she did, I think I'd fall apart and I wouldn't be able to function. And that's not an option for me right now in my life. 3 kids and a job and everything. I have to function.
Yes.
So I need to get to the point, I think, where I'm strong enough to take it if they were to turn their backs on me. They're there. I know where they are. It's going to happen.
That's just such a weird feeling to know them and see pictures of them and they don't know that you exist.
I know. It is weird. It's very weird. It's again, I come away thinking that adoption is just a very strange very strange social construct, especially closed adoption. I remember reading where someone saying closed adoption is a failed social experiment. And I think that's right. I don't know who thought of this great idea of closed adoption. Like, whose idea was that to, close off your biological relatives, change your name on your birth certificate, hide your existence, pretend that all the secrets and lies and pretends. I don't know whose idea that was, but it was a terrible idea, and it definitely failed.
I agree. I agree. Well, we are coming to the end of our time. I'm so sorry because I've had such an awesome time talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
You too. Thank you for talking to me.
Yeah. I had asked if you had any recommended resources that you wanted to share with our listeners, and I have one to share. So why don't I start? Have you heard of Angela Tucker?
I have.
Yeah, so she did that documentary Closure.
Yes.
And she has a new series that's just started on YouTube. It is called The Adopted Life. And the first episode is her interviewing several young people who are all transracial adoptees, some of them international. And it was really just a fascinating watch for me. Have you seen that yet?
I did. I loved it. She's amazing. Absolutely. Yeah. And I hope that adoptive life gets a lot of traction and there's a lot of views of it. I think it's a really important subject. And yes, I have seen it. It's terrific.
Yeah, it's awesome. Great. I'm glad you have. So what do you have for us?
I've got a few. I had mentioned Lost Daughters before, which is a website that I look at. I read a lot. I get a lot out of that. There's a couple other blogs that I read a lot. I really get a lot out of reading other adoptees' views and blogs and Twitter and that sort of thing because, there's no sort of adoptee resources for me here. I don't belong to any kind of support group. I don't really know of anyone. I've looked for support groups. I can't find them. So I kind of get my support from the web. So there's a blog called Baby Girl Be Adoptee. I read that all the time, and she has a wonderful, wonderful piece called Sympathy versus Empathy. And it's about adoptees aren't looking for people's sympathy. We don't want people to feel sorry for us. We're just looking for empathy and how different those two are. And that really resonated with me. There's a piece by a psychiatrist called, his name is Paul Sunderland. He did a lecture, and it's on YouTube, and it's about adoption and about sort of the profound effects that adoption has on a newborn. I read a blog called Declassified Adoptee, and I'm sure you read that one,
yes,
right?
I do.
She's wonderful. Amanda Transu-Woolston, I think is how you say her name. And she's from Pennsylvania and an activist there. I would love to meet her someday. She's like a rock star.
Yeah, I agree.
And then the last one is one that I go on every so often. It's called adultadopteesupport.org. It's an adult, just like it said, adult adoptee support sort of website. Folks are anonymous there, and it's a kind of a wonderful site for people all over the spectrum of adoption in terms of people very much in the fog, totally out of the fog, everything in between. One of the administrators there wrote this piece called Am I Blood or Am I Water? It was transformative for me. It was a wonderful, wonderful piece of writing about his life and about being adoptive and how he felt about it and how he still feels about it. And it's one of the best things I've ever read about adoption. It's called, again, Am I Blood or Am I Water?
That sounds wonderful. I'm going to put those links up so that people can check those out. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you for being so honest. I really, really appreciated that.
Thank you, Haley. It feels good to talk about it. It really does. It's a good thing. And I hope that anything I say could be helpful to any other adoptee out there. If they hear one thing that resonates with them, I just hope that that's helpful.
If you would like to send a note to Maeve to thank her for sharing her heart with us, we can pass it along to her. You can email us on our website, adopteeson.com. We want to hear from you. Connect with us to share your story or record a short voicemail that we could feature in an upcoming episode. You can also find us on Twitter or Instagram at Adoptees On. We would love it if you would take a minute today to subscribe to our show in iTunes. Then you'll never miss an episode. Would you share our show with a friend in your life that you know is adopted but never talks about it? They might be able to open up their box by hearing Maeve's story. Thanks for listening. Let's talk again soon.